In this lecture, we're going to be looking at three styles: minimalism, post-minimalism, and conceptualism. We're going to start out with minimalism, which is a style of art that people definitely have mixed feelings about. This is a style that came out of America in the 1960s. Now, in the comparison I provide here, I think we have a pretty effective look at where we are at in the artistic climate of America in the mid-20th century. So in a previous lecture, we learned about pop art, and this was a style that was essentially a reaction against what was perceived to be the increasing intellectualism and elitism of the art world. So what we have with pop art is this focus on bringing representation back to art. And it's not just simply representation, but it's images that comprise of the most banal, everyday aspects of the mundane daily life. That is where that challenge to intellectualism and elitism is happening. Now, minimalism is another style that pop art rallies against. This one, probably to pop artists, is even more egregious in its intellectualism and elitism than their other main target, which was abstract expressionism. Now let's talk about minimalism. What is this style all about? Really, I think what it comes down to is this idea of reducing down to the absolute extreme, to the absolute limit. So again, we're working with ideas regarding purity. And of course, this was promoted by our favorite art critic, good old Clement Greenberg. So of course, we need to think about celebrating the unique features of the artistic medium when we talk about this style as well. We know from Greenberg's theory that for painting this involved flatness, but how does this play out for sculpture? What this means is that for sculpture, we have a focus on objecthood. Objecthood. Now here's what this means. Objecthood, what makes a sculpture a sculpture. And that is that a sculpture is a three-dimensional object that resides within the viewer's actual space, period. So minimalism is really first and foremost about this idea of physicality. There's so much focus on physicality that I like to call minimalism the style of no. What does that mean? Okay, here are the rules of minimalism. No representation or suggestion of depth. No expression of a feeling. No expression of emotion. So basically, no content. No texture. No formal element or design principle at all that would function to convey any emotion or an idea or have any sort of psychological impact. No gesture or hand of the artist is apparent. No organic materials. This would connect the work to nature and therefore it would give it meaning, which is a no-no. No biomorphic shapes, for the same exact reason, connects to nature. And in that, what we're really seeing is virtually exclusively with minimalism, the use of geometric shape, because it's the least expressive of the shapes. And finally, no base, if it's a sculpture. It will just sit on the floor, because it's just meant to really be an object sitting on a floor. And when you add a pedestal, that elevates it, and that's a problem. So with all these rules of no, all we can really do is describe this as a three-dimensional object. And that was the point, to celebrate its objecthood. It's an object and nothing else. Now, let's consider all these rules with the work of art we see here, Die by Tony Smith. What the artist did was essentially to make this work, he called in the specs to some like factory or something. Essentially, he had a cube manufactured from an industrial material, in this case, steel. So he calls up the place, he says, hi, make me a cube, 6 feet by 6 feet by 6 feet, deliver it to such and such gallery, thanks, bye, there's your work of art. Now, this is important, this calling in of the specs, because this means that the artist never touched the work of art. We don't want the artist to touch the work, because if the artist touched it, he could have accidentally have had some sort of gesture recorded, which would then be expressive. Let's look at some other examples. So minimalism, it was also known as ABC art, which is a reference to fundamentals, like the ABCs of things. And in an essay written by Barbara Rose, who was a well-known art critic, she described minimalism as a style that advocated for an art that was neutral, blank, and impersonal. To, and I quote, chill its viewers with its lack of content or feeling. So you can see this is very much in contrast to some of the more romantic, heroic, emotional qualities of abstract expressionism. This piece is by an early minimalist artist, Frank Stella. It's considered one of the earlier minimalist works, who infamously described this style as, what you see is what you see. Wow. This is one of a series of 24 large-scale paintings that he made, where he essentially painted black enamel stripes onto raw canvas, which that should already be kind of ringing some bells here, this idea of raw canvas, because it's essential to the medium of painting. And with the approach that Stella undertook here, we see that he's able to harness that sense of flatness, which also is important to painting as well. We can see also with this piece that it's non-representational. It's essentially an arrangement of geometric shapes. And we also have a lack of color, and that helps to really be sure that there's no emotional reaction to what we've got going on here. But let me ask you a question. Does this painting follow all the rules of minimalism? Pause and think about this for a moment. There is one problem here. Can you find it? If you said the title, you would be correct. That title gives the work meaning, and that is a huge problem. Here's another early minimalist piece by Agnes Martin, who's considered to be an especially important figure with sort of the introduction and the institutionalization of the minimalist style. What she's well known for is the grid approach that she took to painting. It was a systematic approach, very similar to that of Stella, who we saw in the previous slide. And in her approach, also we see this emphasis being placed on what is essential to painting. Here the grid is functioning to combine the foreground and the background, collapsing the space so two become one and the same. It's flat. And this is made possible by this all-over approach where there's no focal point. And this forces the viewer to read the pieces as a whole. And that was really important to minimalist artists, that artwork be seen as one sort of cohesive whole rather than parts that come together to create a whole. Now with Agnes Martin's grid system, we have a work that is symmetrical, it's precise, it's carefully ordered, so it's very, rational. The grid is uniform within the painting. But this grid is not necessarily unified across the spectrum of Martin's work, right? She's known for these grid paintings, but they don't all look just like this. The grids differ in appearance from piece to piece. Now, the grids are similar in that they combine the delicate pencil marks that create this grid, and then that grid is kind of over this very subtle monochromatic staining. Now, this is not a Frankenthaler staining where it's soak and stain and all that business. This is a controlled staining. But the effect is the same, and this is important. With that staining technique, no gesture, right? No gesture. Now, her more denser grids seem to imitate the appearance of woven fabric. Now, it's important because you could see this perhaps as a reference to the texture of canvas, right? And so therefore we have an emphasis on the physicality of the materials and again the essentials of painting itself. However, Martin's work is not totally and completely minimalist, right? What's the problem? You've got it. It's the title again, right? The title we have here gives us an engagement with the organic, with nature. And clearly this is an abstract relationship, since these geometric forms don't necessarily visually or conceptually relate to nature. But this was something that she was clear about. Her works, she wanted them to be having a spiritual quality, to provide with the viewer a sense of contemplation and meditation. She is not sorry about this title and creating meaning. She's definitely the rebel, obviously, in the minimalist movement. Now, to me, what this goes to show is that minimalism wasn't necessarily a style that artists could completely and totally embrace, even if they wanted to. And if they could, maybe they weren't really able to commit to it for a very long time. Because it seems like no matter what they try to do, that this meaning or expression seems to subtly creep in, right? We kind of saw this with Stella's work. We're seeing it with Martin's work here. And I think that this is because minimalism does contrast some of the more fundamental motivations that go into the very act of art making. Let's look into this idea further. Here's some more examples of some minimalist pieces. And they do, in a sense, provide us with a solution to this title problem. How about just don't title the works at all? So just creating works of art, all of them kind of called untitled, becomes a common strategy for minimalist artists. But yet, we've got all these restrictive rules, and they're just too impossible to follow. So it's time for you to test yourself to see how well you understand the style of minimalism. You've got 3 works here, all minimalist pieces, but yet they still in some way break at least one of the rules of no. So take a look, pause the video, try to figure out how each piece breaks the rule. So hopefully you did that. Let's start with Dan Flavin. Dan Flavin, I think, is pretty important in the history of art because he was a pioneer in using light in art. Now, at first glance, this is a great minimalist piece. It's a mass-produced object, this fluorescent light, presented as a work of art. And this feels very Duchampian to me. What do we call this type of artwork? This is a ready-made, right? A mass-produced object presented as a work of art. So in terms of material and the absolute minimal, in this case light, can't get much more minimal than that, this seems right in line with minimalism. So what's the problem? 2 things. First of all, the light is yellow. There are all sorts of associations that we can make with that color, and there's all sorts of ways that this color can make the viewer feel. 2, the light is placed at a diagonal, which can definitely provoke feelings. What would have been the better choices that Dan Flavin could have made to make this work more in line with the style? Well, I think he could have avoided colored light, and I think maybe it would have worked to have placed the light either horizontally or vertically, although, as we know, even those directions can incite feelings and psychological associations. So maybe there really isn't even a solution. I don't know. How about Robert Ryman's painting? So it's got a lack of color, it's just white, it's achromatic. We've got analytical line, geometric shape. So far, so good. What's the problem? 2 problems. 1, there's texture, right? That's a no-no. And 2, that texture exists because you can see gesture. If you look close, you can see the brushwork that the artist put in there. The hand of the artist is visible. And then we've got Donald Judd, who has these repeated plexiglass boxes. Repetition of shape, right? Repetition of shape, we saw this with Judd, we saw this with Martin, we saw this with Stella. Repetition is a very important principle of design in minimalist art. And particularly that would be a repetition of geometric shape. Now this is great, right? There's no representation. It's a prefabricated work, so Judd did not touch it. It's made from a manufactured industrial material, so that's good. So what's the problem? This is the hard one. This is the true test. If you look closely at the material, what do you notice? It's hard to tell this, but it's reflective. And what that means is when the viewer walks up to this piece, they will be reflected in the artwork. Now, this is important because any time a viewer ever becomes visible in an artwork, it's something to take note of. When you see your reflection, what it's doing is it's encouraging you as the viewer to be self-reflective, to consider yourself, to consider your interaction with the artwork, etc. And this is obviously a problem in the case of minimalist art, because if the viewer sees themselves, then they start thinking about things and feeling things, and they're not just simply appreciating this sculpture for objecthood. Now, I know what you're asking. What did people really think about this style? And like everything in life, it's varied. Some critics loved it. They thought that purity truly had finally been achieved in art. They thought the works were daring in their simplicity, that these works challenged the very idea of monotony, and that was seen as very avant-garde. Now, other critics, and indeed the wider public, felt alienated by this work, that the style had moved art away from this idea of human expression, that there was nothing to connect with. The work was so impersonal and so far removed from life, from emotion, from anything referential. It made it really difficult to understand. And a lot of people felt that there was something sort of authoritarian about the style, in not a good way, that minimalism was like aggressively projecting these lofty positions onto art that robbed the viewer of the ability to contribute to the interactive process. Now, I know the real question, though, that you're all thinking. What did Greenberg think about this? Believe it or not, Greenberg actually was not a huge fan of minimalism, which is shocking. Here's why. Maybe you could even guess why, right? He felt that minimalism took away from the optical experience, which he was really big on that idea. And he felt that at this point, this idea of physicality was old news. That the minimalists were not really like bringing to the table anything new and anything that was really meaningful. Remember, with Greenberg, his laws of modernism were predicated on this idea of progression, of moving forward. Modern art needed to move forward. And you're not moving forward if you're just simply rehashing ideas that, in Greenberg's mind, were not new. But don't you worry. At this point, people were caring less and less about what Greenberg thought. He was like Icarus, and he flew too close to the sun. People were tiring of his authoritative positions on art, and they were more so questioning, rightly, his highly subjective and seemingly arbitrary basis for exalting certain types of art and artists at the expense of others. Now, with minimalism, there's a shift, and it happens quite quickly. Minimalism emerges at the beginning of the 1960s, and as we know, it's a style that's very rigid in setting out the style's wider goals and how these goals are articulated in the artist's approach to art making. But in a few short years, by the end of the decade, we already see a trend, what is known as post-minimalism. So it's a moving on beyond post-minimalism, but as the name suggests, there's still a relationship with minimalism that's retained. And we see this in two key aspects. One is visual. Can you see it here? More organic forms get to be brought in. And the other has to do with meaning, that art can go back to communicating something. A common thing we see with post-minimalist works is that meaning comes in part from the viewer's physical interaction to the piece. Now this makes sense because remember, minimalism was all about objecthood, but that included how the object sat in space. With Sarah's belts, we can see that there's a loosening up of form, where we're moving away from the closed geometric forms of the minimalists. Further, look at the erratic way that these belts hang. There's almost something expressive about it, almost gestural in a way. And this would never, of course, have been seen with earlier minimalist work. This looser quality is enhanced or even made more visually prominent by the neon that we see in that first set of belts. Fluorescent light has a strong presence in post-minimalist work. We even have a little bit of color here, right? A little range of color. The idea behind this work, and a great deal of Sarah's work and post-minimalist work as a whole, is its relationship that the viewer establishes with the piece. The idea is that we get to have our own personal relationship with the piece. We've returned to a place where we can somewhat form our own interpretations or have our own reactions. These reactions or interpretations are not taken from us, nor are they prescribed to us through these overly limiting rules. And that was that aggressiveness that people were perceiving from the minimalist style. Now again, though, this is post-minimalist, so we still need to think about the connections that the style will have to minimalism. Can you see these connections? We've got the physical presence of the work, and that's still considered to be really important. And where we're seeing this is really being emphasized in the title, which is simply descriptive, belts. It's still reductive, reducing down to essential of the medium, right? The physicality, the form. It's non-representational. And we're seeing that it's still using, I guess an industrial material, or if this is leather, that would be a natural material. Looks like it's a mix of both to me. The neon certainly is industrial, and then the leather would be more of a natural material. Let's look at some more examples to get a sense of this style. Let's look at Martin Puryear. So with here we see, some of the same qualities as Sarah's work and Puryear's work. Physical presence is still considered to be of the utmost importance. Still reductive, reducing down to the essential, form, non-representational, and take a look. There's no base. These sit on the floor. But what's different, right? Puryear's work is bringing back the hand of the artist, in a way, right? Ish. So he carved these, right? They're made out of wood. He carved them, but we don't see the gesture. Now, he makes sure that material is important, right? Which that's a link with minimalism. But it's a different type of material, right? This is natural materials, wood particularly, not the industrial materials of minimalism. We can see with this piece that Puryear's work has more of an organic quality with these softly rounded curvilinear shapes. Much of Puryear's work is typical to this, where it tends to be these closed form shapes that clearly communicate a dense mass. And again, we can link that to minimalist emphasis on objecthood and materiality. But take a look at the titles, right? A lot of Puryear's work, and this kind of goes along with his natural materials he uses, do reference nature. And this is happening visually, it's happening conceptually, and again, through material. His work, a lot of it is about spatial and visual relationships, the relationships between mass, volume, and both interior and exterior space, which you can see both of these here. They both have holes in them, and the idea is the viewer can come up and take a glimpse inside. And what that does is it forms a very close, intimate relationship between the viewer and the piece. So again, this post-minimalist idea of involving the viewer and allowing the viewer to come up with their own interpretations. So here's one more. We've got Hesse's hang up. Try to test yourself here. What is minimalist? What is post-minimalist? Pause the video and see if you can make these identifications. Let's start with what's minimalist. It's non-representational, strong presence of geometric shape, industrial materials, and there's this wire, and it extends out into the gallery, and that does address the notion of space, which we know was something that the minimalists were into. Now, what's post-minimalist? The wire is post-minimalist in that the shape is organic. It interacts with gravity. It enters into the viewer's space very dynamically. It makes the viewer aware of the space. So it's bridging some of the emotional and intellectual distance, both figuratively and literally, that minimalist works tend to impose on the viewer. Hesse intended these sort of organic shapes that occupy the immediate space of the viewer to have meaning, which we know is post-minimalist. Her work addresses topics such as growth, decay, and intimacy, emotional things that minimalist artists would run away from as fast as they absolutely could. And so, we move on now to our third and final style, Conceptualism. Now, the Conceptualist movement officially spanned the 1960s and 1970s, and beyond that point, it's grown and developed beyond its original context and function. It came out of a time, as we know, that artists are really trying to push the envelope to create and define avant-garde and that concept in ways that were never seen before. And as time passed, this was getting harder and harder to do. Conceptualism is also coming out of a time where the art world was continuing to place emphasis on intellectualism. Artists were starting to really actively consider art theory when creating artwork. Now, with this emphasis on intellect, we see the same sort of thing that we saw with minimalism. However, the difference with conceptualism, concept, right? Conceptualism, concept, is that there's more of an emphasis on the idea, which we know minimalism was not at all about. Yet, at the same time, there still was this possibility with conceptualism to also create emotional disconnect, because remember, the intellectual isn't typically meant to be emotional. Now, many artists and art historians position Duchamp as the first true conceptualist, even though the movement didn't officially begin until decades later. And yeah, Duchamp is one of the most significant and influential artists in the entire history of art and was ahead of his time in so many ways. So this isn't like out in left field to make this suggestion. And why would people credit him with such an accolade? How about because he was the first one who truly advocated for the primacy of the idea, that it was the concept that made art art, and that the object was simply the passive vehicle to communicate the idea, which was pretty much the complete opposite of minimalism, by the way. Now, with both minimalism and conceptualism, the work is reductivist, reduces down to an object or an idea, respectively, right? Minimalism reducing down to object, conceptualism reducing down to idea. Now, with this emphasis on reducing down, some art historians have said that conceptualism is an extension of minimalism, an outgrowth. Some, though, have said that it's rejection of minimalism because that style was so anti-concept. You can decide for yourself. Now, other art historians say that Yves Klein was the first conceptualist. Although many conceptualist artists of the time did look back specifically to Duchamp as a historical influence in their work, and they are quite clear about that, as they should be. Now, other styles that Klein has been associated with, in addition to conceptualism, include neorealism, new realism, also known as, by some, neo-dada. It's essentially using art to capture the reality of our times, but capturing this reality in a non-conventional way. And it does place significance on the random, and the ideas are communicated through the random, right? Randomly, we've got ideas being communicated. So I'm sure it's not going to surprise you that with this emphasis on the idea and how to, using the random to communicate ideas, that there's really not going to be a single approach in terms of the visual end on this style. No visual characteristics are going to appear repeatedly in work of multiple artists associated with conceptualism. I love Yves Klein, though. I'm going to tell you that right now. So what he did is he made a series of nearly 200 monochrome, one-color paintings. Here's one of the 200. And this was a color that he invented. IKB stands for International Klein Blue. He invented this color blue from a close collaboration with a chemist, and then he had it patented in 1960. The reason why he patented it through this work with the chemist is it put this chemical compound in there, so when you put the blue onto the canvas, the brushwork wasn't visible. Just as like one sort of uniform surface. This really is what it looks like. Now, Klein's IKB works, they've rejected representation, obviously, plain blue square, which let's just say a thank you into the afterlife to Kazimir Malevich, father of squares, right? Plain blue square. But here we have this focus on the purity of form and color, which within the viewer, it was meant to encourage a deep and serene contemplation. The works are solid, right? Removed of painterly traces, as we know. Now, with this non-representational series, again, the focus is meant to be on anti-materialism, moving away from the object and all the wonderful things that come when we reject the material world. Things like purity, quality, spirituality, right? Again, it's this whole Malevich idea of removing the painting from the burden of the object. Now, that concept is needed because if you don't have the concept, all this is a canvas that's being painted blue. Now, I know what you're thinking. What a load of crap. But you know what? I've sat where you've sat before. I sat in an art history survey course when I was first learning about art, and I too thought, what a load of crap. But I'll tell you a little story. Shortly into my career as an art historian, an art historian in training, it was only my second year of college, I went to the Museum of Modern Art in San Francisco, and I saw an IKB in person. And I want you to know that out of all the artworks that I've seen in my day, and at this point, 19 years later or however long, I can still say that this is probably, or the one that I saw of Yves Klein's work, was probably the most beautiful work of art I've ever seen in my life. I have never laid my eyes on a blue that is so pure and so deep and so true. It's a blue that even defies explanation. You can't get a sense of it in a book. You can't get a sense of it on this screen. You have to see it in person. It is my desire, my wish for you, that you someday get the opportunity to see a Yves Klein in person. The way that this blue sits against the white wall of the gallery space is so visually arresting. And it does pull you in. I stood in front of this thing for I was that stereotype for 10 minutes just looking at it. I did enter in to this sort of infinite space, looking at this incredible, vivid blue. So gorgeous. Let's talk a little bit more about Yves Klein, just because I'm such a big fan. Now, in 1958, Klein created an art exhibit that was considered to be particularly groundbreaking. And this is, more than any of his other pieces, what really makes him an early conceptualist. And in fact, out of all the pieces that we're going to look at, all three in this lecture, this is the one that I think is most conceptualist. So in the city of Paris, in the Iris Claire Gallery, he put on an exhibit called The Void, right? Now, this is already connecting really nicely to those notions of infinity and purity, right? That idea of the void that he's working with in his IKB monochrome paintings that he made over 200 of. What this was an empty gallery. And all it had in it was a couple of cabinets that displayed nothing inside. Here's a photograph. So essentially, what is happening is this is an exhibit where the display is air. Now, that really is taking it down to the minimal, right? Now you don't even need the object to convey the idea. The idea just exists. My mind is just blown right now. The idea just exists, right? Emptiness is indicative of infinity. And it's that search for the infinite that's part of the spiritual quest that drove Klein's art making. People in Paris came out in droves to see this because this was controversial. What happens when things are controversial? People want to know what all the hullabaloo is about. So they came in and they lined up, right, around the block. So some people came in and they just left immediately. They were just laughing at how completely ridiculous this was. Other people came in and stayed for hours on end, marveling at the beauty and the intensity of it all. So many people came that they couldn't all see the exhibit. So people were stuck outside, couldn't get in. But Klein decided he'd make another work of art that was in conjunction with the void for those people who waited in line but could not get in. He served them blue drinks, and those blue drinks were the same exact color of his IKB. But it didn't end there. He arranged with a chemist to put some sort of compound in the drink so that when people drank the drink, surprise later on, their urine was deep blue for about a week. Now, urine as an art medium, this seems like another novel concept, and surely it is. But this is not the first time that we see an artist using bodily secretions in artwork. We go back again to Marcel Duchamp, his Passage Fautif of 1946, which is this beautiful, expressive painting, or what it appears to be painting, but really is semen, ejaculation on a piece of black silk. We'll finish up with one more piece, Joseph Kosuth's 1 and 3 Chairs. Right? Very typical conceptualist piece. Kosuth is a conceptual artist whose work really does give us an example of this more intellectualized approach to art making. The work has 3 parts to it. There's a photograph of a chair, the actual chair itself, and then the words that make up the dictionary definition of chair. So his work is asking the viewer to evaluate the ways in which meaning is constructed, the way that objects truly are defined. He's presenting 3 approaches to the concept of a chair. Which here truly is the embodiment of a chair? Which here best captures the chairness of a chair? Which approach do we trust the most to give us the clearest idea of what truly is a chair? I've lately been in a debate about this very idea, which has made me appreciate this work of Kosuth all the more. It has to do with thoughts. Do we consider thought, right? And thoughts are like ideas, thoughts are like concept. Do we consider thoughts language? Because they are, in a way, composed of words in our minds. Are thoughts distinct from spoken words? What is the interplay between reality, representation, the idea? Now, my current debate aside, we can say that language is culturally specific. So not everyone's going to identify a chair through words. Different languages have different words for chair. But most people could recognize the representation of a chair, regardless of what language they speak. This would create the argument that images take primacy, that they're more important than words when it comes to communication. But perhaps we need the actual chair object to fully understand the dimensionality of the chair, its physical properties, rather than the photograph, which then makes me wonder, how reliant are we on photographs to convey an object or an idea? Should we place that much faith in photographic representation? Clearly, there's a lot of things that this piece is encouraging us to contemplate. So you can see that with Kosuth's work and conceptualism, it's the extreme opposite of Greenberg's idealized optical experience of abstract expressionism, and that was Kosuth's point. He argued that these traditional approaches to art making, painting and sculpture, and their qualities that Greenberg was so obsessed about, that these are now expendable. They're not necessary. All you need was the idea. And that sure sounds a whole lot to me like Marcel Duchamp.